Major Andre Wallace had just finished a 3-day high-level military briefing at Fort Benning and was driving back to his temporary base when blue and red lights lit up behind him. He was still in uniform, decorated chest medals gleaming, his ID clipped to his collar. Andre, a 38-year-old intelligence officer with over 15 years of service, had been through war zones in Afghanistan, covert missions in Africa, and led a task unit that dismantled a cyber-terror ring. But none of that prepared him for what would happen on that American road. The police cruiser belonged to Officer Brent Mallory, a local cop with a checkered history, numerous complaints for excessive force, most of them dismissed without consequence. Bodycam footage later revealed he never even checked the plate before walking up aggressively, hand on gun. "Step out the car. Now," he barked. Andre remained calm, hands clearly visible. "I'm Major Andre Wallace, U.S. Army. I'm on active duty." But Brent didn't care. He shouted for Andre to get on the ground, and as Wallace attempted to reach for his ID badge, the officer fired, twice. One bullet grazed Andre's shoulder. He collapsed but didn't pass out. And that's when everything changed. A trucker in the opposite lane caught the shooting on dashcam. Passers-by were already calling 911. But the call that made the biggest impact? Andre's emergency alert, triggered through his military-issue smartwatch. It pinged a secure Pentagon channel marked Urgent, Personnel Down. Back in Washington, D.C., inside a high-security room at the Pentagon, a red alert message appeared on the secure terminal of General Marie Lockhart, Director of Military Intelligence Operations. The alert read, "Active duty major wounded, suspected civilian engagement, live coordinates attached." Within seconds, her eyes locked on the name, Major Andre Wallace. Marie slammed her coffee down and barked, "Get me Joint Command. Now." She had personally worked with Wallace. He wasn't just a good officer, he was one of their best minds in counterterrorism. Losing him to enemy fire overseas would have been tragic. Losing him to gunfire on American soil by local law enforcement? That was political dynamite. Within 15 minutes, the Pentagon had deployed a federal task force. 5 blacked-out SUVs left Fort Benning en route to the scene. The FBI's Civil Rights Division was already mobilizing. The Department of Defense sent a legal liaison. The White House had been briefed. And by the time Officer Brent Mallory finally realized who he had shot the moment Major Wallace's emergency alert hit the Pentagon's classified personnel system, red flags lit up across several screens. Within 90 seconds, his status had been escalated to critical incident, hostile domestic engagement. Lieutenant General Carla Monroe, head of the Department of Homeland Security Military Liaison Division, was in a meeting with senior defense officials when her aide whispered, "We have a man down, Major Wallace." Civilian law enforcement involved. Everything stopped. Wallace wasn't just another soldier. He was part of a covert joint force counterintelligence unit, privy to classified domestic surveillance data. If he was targeted, intentionally or not, it wasn't just tragic. It was a national security breach. Monroe stood, slammed the file shut, and said 5 words that would change everything. "Get me boots on ground." Back in Georgia, paramedics had arrived. Officer Brent Mallory was pacing, yelling, trying to spin the story. He reached for something. "I thought it was a weapon." But witnesses had already stepped in, several of whom recorded the entire encounter. A retired Marine intervened, pushing past the police tape and shouting, "He said he was Army. In uniform. And you still shot him?" Less than 30 minutes after the gunfire, the rumble of helicopters echoed over the town. 2 black military choppers landed on the highway. 4 armored black SUVs arrived in convoy formation. Out stepped the Pentagon's Special Domestic Task Force. Agents in tactical gear, badges reading Federal Military Oversight. Local cops were ordered to stand down. The local police chief, caught completely off guard, tried to protest, but Monroe herself appeared via secure call. "Your officer just shot a U.S. intelligence asset. "You don't get to play sheriff anymore." The officer was disarmed on the spot, read his rights by a federal marshal, and taken into protective custody for his own safety. Protesters began gathering within the hour as news broke across major media outlets. Black Army major shot by cop during routine stop. But the nation hadn't heard the full story yet. Within hours, every major news network in America was broadcasting footage of the incident, clips from the officer's shaky bodycam, dashcam footage from a passing trucker, and shaky cell phone videos recorded by stunned bystanders. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForMajorWallace, #HeServedTheyShot, and #FederalReckoning. But the story wasn't just about a wrongful shooting anymore. It was becoming a reckoning for the entire system. CNN aired live footage of Major Wallace in a military hospital, conscious and guarded by Pentagon personnel. President Armitage made a rare unscheduled press statement saying, "Major Wallace is a decorated American hero. Any violation of his rights will be prosecuted to the fullest extent." But as support for Wallace grew, dark truths about Officer Brent Mallory began to surface. Independent journalists uncovered that Mallory had 5 prior complaints of racial bias, 2 of which involved excessive force. One of those cases involved a young black teen who ended up with a broken arm during a so-called routine stop. The cases had been buried under layers of red tape, with internal affairs finding no wrongdoing. But this time, he'd shot the wrong person, and the federal government wasn't playing defense. Investigative reporters from The Guardian dropped a bombshell. Brent Mallory's uncle was a city judge, and his sister worked in the mayor's office, explaining how complaints had been swept under the rug. But those ties wouldn't protect him now. The Department of Justice announced a civil rights investigation, and Officer Mallory was officially charged with attempted manslaughter, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. At a candlelight vigil outside the hospital, veterans, active duty soldiers, and civilians stood side by side holding signs that read, "He served honorably." They treated him like a threat. But the most powerful moment came when Major Wallace released a recorded statement from his hospital. Major Andre Wallace's video statement, just under 4 minutes long, was streamed live from the hospital's secure recovery ward. Dressed in his army fatigues with his arm in a sling and a soft bandage on his shoulder, he looked straight into the camera and spoke with controlled power. "I've saluted presidents. I've led troops into combat zones. I've protected this nation with every ounce of my being. But none of that stopped a man with a badge and a gun from seeing me as a threat instead of a human being. We say we honor the uniform, yet I nearly died wearing it, on American soil." The video racked up 12 million views in 6 hours, trended #1 on YouTube, and was played in Congress during a heated emergency hearing on policing reform. Celebrities reposted it. Military veterans across racial and political lines voiced outrage. Civil rights leaders began calling it the uniform paradox, the idea that black Americans can serve a country that doesn't always serve them back. But Wallace didn't want fame or vengeance. In a follow-up press conference from his hospital bed, he made his intentions clear. "This is not just about me. It's about every black man who gets pulled over for no reason. It's about every soldier who risks everything abroad only to be disrespected at home. I don't want a settlement. I want structural change." Behind the scenes, things were already moving. The Pentagon announced a sweeping review of how military personnel are treated by civilian law enforcement. Congress introduced a bipartisan bill titled the Wallace Amendment, mandating that all local departments undergo mandatory federal review if they encounter active duty personnel in use-of-force incidents. Officer Mallory was denied bail. Internal investigations were opened into the city's leadership. The mayor, under pressure, resigned. The local police department was placed under federal oversight for the first time in state history. But the most surprising move came from Major Wallace himself. 2 weeks after his release from the hospital, he resigned from the Army, not in protest but in purpose. he announced he would be running for public office, saying, "I defended America from enemies abroad. Now I'm ready to protect its people from injustice at home." 6 months later, Major Andre Wallace stood behind a modest podium in front of a cheering crowd in his hometown. A large banner above him read, "Wallace for Congress, Justice has no rank." His campaign wasn't built on fame, it was built on purpose. Every debate, every speech, every town hall was packed. People didn't just see a man running for office, they saw a man who had survived the worst and turned it into a movement. Veterans, students, single mothers, and lifelong politicians began backing him. But the backlash came fast. Wallace's opponents labeled him too radical, too angry, and even anti-police, despite his years of military service. His campaign offices were vandalized. One of his town halls received a bomb threat. Through it all, Wallace remained calm. "I've stared down enemies with weapons drawn. You think words and slander scare me?" As election day neared, one final twist emerged. An anonymous source leaked a hidden bodycam clip that had never been released. It showed Officer Mallory receiving a call 15 minutes before the shooting, warning him that a suspicious black man in military gear was walking into the gas station. The call had been placed by a hotel clerk, one Wallace had previously reported for racial profiling. The revelation changed everything. It wasn't just a trigger-happy cop, Wallace had been set up. The clip aired nationally 2 days before the election. Outrage flooded back with new force. The hotel chain issued a national apology. The clerk was arrested for filing a false report. Election night arrived. Pundits were unsure, could Wallace overcome the machine, the fear, the dirty tricks? He didn't just win. He won by a landslide. Standing before his supporters, he held back tears and said, "This wasn't just a campaign. This was a message. You can't silence truth forever. You can't bury justice with lies. And no matter your uniform, civilian or soldier, dignity must never be optional." And as fireworks lit the sky, one question echoed across America. If one man's story could spark this much change, what more could we do together? Would you vote for someone like Major Wallace? Once sworn into office, Congressman Andre Wallace wasted no time. He introduced his first piece of legislation within 48 hours, the Federal Uniform Protection Act, a bill aimed at mandating federal-level accountability whenever active-duty military personnel or veterans are harmed by law enforcement or institutions while in uniform. But that was only the beginning. Wallace wasn't content with being a symbolic figure. He sat on committees that dealt with criminal justice reform, civil rights, and military affairs. His speeches were fiery but intelligent, blending lived experience with policy expertise. News outlets across the spectrum called him the conscience of the Capitol. Opponents who once called him too emotional were forced to debate him on merit and lost. Meanwhile, communities across the country rallied behind his movement. Police departments began independently requesting bias training and oversight to avoid being the next headline. States modeled their local reforms on the Wallace Amendment. And perhaps most surprisingly, a rising number of veterans, especially Black and Latino, began running for office, citing Wallace as their inspiration. But Wallace stayed humble. In one viral town hall, when a young girl asked, "Do you feel powerful now?" he smiled and said, "Power isn't about control. It's about responsibility. I didn't run to be powerful. I ran because I was tired of watching powerful people do nothing." Still, not everyone was happy. A powerful law enforcement lobby began mounting campaigns to smear his record. An extremist group even attempted to intimidate him by marching outside his home at night. Wallace responded the next morning with his trademark calm. "If you're marching in fear, I'm standing in truth. You lose." As the second year of his term came, whispers of a presidential run began circulating. Wallace shrugged them off, saying, "Let me finish what I started here first." But his approval rating soared. Donations flooded in from all 50 states. His name trended regularly alongside words like hope, change, and real leadership. One reporter asked him directly, "You went from bleeding on the sidewalk to rewriting national policy. What's your endgame, Congressman Wallace?" He paused, smiled, and said, "When no child has to fear the people meant to protect them, I'll finally rest. Until then, I keep marching." 3 years after being shot by a racist cop, Andre Wallace stood before the nation, not as a victim, not even as a congressman, but as a leading contender for the presidency of the United States. His journey was brutal. His military record was torn apart, his family scrutinized, and his mental health used as a weapon in attack ads. But Wallace never wavered. His campaign slogan, "Never Again," became a national movement, vowing that injustice would no longer wear a badge unchallenged, nor would silence replace justice. He rallied support from the forgotten. Homeless veterans, grieving mothers, ex-convicts, and even billionaires tired of the broken system. On the anniversary of his shooting, he visited the gas station where it all began, now a community center in his name. And months later, on a cold January morning, he took the oath as the 48th President of the United States. Somewhere, a young black child watched and asked, "If he rose after being shot, what can I do?" Would you vote for a man like Andre Wallace?